In today's video, I'm going to be reviewing 5 of the most common deadlift variations that you're likely to see executed in the weight room, and in brief, I'll be touching base on a few points relative to each specific deadlift variation. First on the list, we've got the trap bar deadlift. It looks a little something like this. One of the greatest benefits of the trap bar deadlift is it's relatively easy to learn this variation. It's a simple one. Now, because of that, it has a very low entrance skill set and becomes a great lift for beginning lifters. And as a byproduct, they can become proficient at the trap bar deadlift relatively quickly, and therefore are able to apply greater degrees of stress considering load while maintaining quality of form. And because it tends to emphasize the same general muscle groups as more difficult deadlift variations do, it allows them to apply greater degrees of stress to both the muscular system and the central nervous system. And that will lead to a relative adaptation in which they're able to build more muscle and increased levels of strength. That allows them to bring that newfound muscle and strength over to those more difficult variations in the future and more efficiently develop the skills required to execute those variations with a greater degree of proficiency. Now, the majority of trap bars actually have 2 handle heights, and this is great, and I love this from a coaching standpoint because there's generally 2 types of people that are going to struggle through a full range of motion on certain pulling variations. That's going to be people who just don't have adequate strength in those increased range of motion yet, and also people who, based off of the way their structure is, they just struggle to get into those deep ranges of motion while maintaining a quality setup position. So for both of these groups of people, the trap bar, employing a higher handle position, allows them to strengthen their posterior chain, their mid and lower back, their glutes, their hamstrings, without compromising form or without sacrificing quality form in order to get into ranges of motion that they're either maybe not ready for yet or that structurally just aren't going to be as beneficial when considering risk versus reward. A point worth noting as well is the carryover when employing a neutral grip hand positioning to increased grip strength. This is something I've noticed both with clients as well as with myself in my own training, is that, say for example, I was pulling a sumo or conventional deadlift without straps. I am always able to lift more on the trap bar without straps, assuming on the conventional or sumo we're comparing a double overhand grip placement. This means that more stress can be applied on the trap bar to the musculature of the hand as well as the forearms without employing that strap assistance, which means that you will experience an adaptation of increased grip strength over time. Next on the list is conventional deadlifts. And conventional deadlifts tend to be the variation that people think about every time they hear a deadlift reference. Here's what they look like. Now, I love the conventional deadlift when it comes to prioritizing the glutes, hamstrings, and lower back. An incredible amount of stress is placed on those muscles, which is extremely progressive for both their muscular and strength development over time. Now, something that gets brought up quite a lot as a point of concern with the conventional deadlift is whether or not the significant application of stress to the lower back under load is dangerous or potentially damaging. And my thoughts on this are as follows. Generally, risk of injury with an exercise comes from 2 contributing factors. The first being that an individual's form is poor. Most of the time people get injured on exercises because they don't know how to execute the lift itself with a high enough quality of form. And the second reason is because their loading approach, either in terms of the total load on the bar or in consideration of the volume of the work that they plan to do on that exercise during that training session is unreasonable. Now, recognizing that, my personal preference when programming the conventional deadlift is it is extremely rare for me to program it for more than 6 consecutive repetitions on a per set basis. Further, I almost never, ever program more than a 1 to 2% increase in total volume. I'm quite diligent with that on this specific exercise. And as an absolute rule, I never program the conventional deadlift for more than 10 reps. As I said, almost always 6 reps or under. On the odd occasion, I might deviate from that. It's extremely rare, but it does happen, but never more than 10. My rationale is as follows. When it comes to injury risk, oftentimes, as I mentioned a few moments ago, poor form is a contributing factor. Well, poor form can set in, form quality can break down as a byproduct of elevated levels of fatigue, especially on a lift where skill is required to a degree. It's not as simple as doing, say, a bicep curl. Now, understanding this, by stopping the repetitions at 6, 99% of the time, or ensuring that the volume increase in that training session does not surpass, say, 2% on the high end, I can, to a degree, manage the level of fatigue that inevitably would set in if, for example, I were to program a max effort set of deadlifts for 15 consecutive repetitions and or allow for, say, a 10, 12, or 15% increase in training volume across all sets. Both of those scenarios would contribute to severe fatigue, and the greater that fatigue grows in that training session when trying to execute a lift like the conventional deadlift, the more likely someone is to get injured. Now, understanding that approach, one thing I do is when it comes to hypertrophy development, muscular size development, there are benefits to hitting the hamstrings, glutes, and lower back as efficiently as the conventional deadlift can. So what I do instead is a stiff leg deadlift variation, which is more of a bodybuilding variation on the conventional deadlift where the bar never actually touches the ground and the legs are held in a relatively static positioning considering the angle of the knee joint throughout the range of motion. This applies a great degree of stress to the hamstrings, glutes, and lower back, but what's interesting is compared to conventional deadlift, the majority of people tend to be able to lift only a fraction of the weight they could. Thereby, I compare the stiff leg deadlift done with a barbell back to itself and program load and volume increases compared back to itself, and the conventional deadlift as a strength exercise is compared only to itself. I do not allow the metrics and the data points on either of those lifts to carry over. I don't make the assumption that, well, if I grab 60% of the conventional deadlift, then I can rock this weight out for so many reps in a stiff leg deadlift. That's not how I compare them. I simply look at the stiff leg deadlift numbers and I build off of those over time when I'm incorporating that specific variation for muscular development. Next up is the sumo deadlift. Check it out. Now, when it comes to the sumo and conventional deadlift, there's some serious debates that can go on the interwebs and social media land about which lift is the better of the two. And my personal opinion is that neither is better than the other. They both prioritize different things. In a general sense, they're both deadlifts and they both work very similar muscle groups, but to different degrees respectively. Now, the other thing is that what you'll often find is that incorporating a hybrid approach of utilizing both of these lifts tends to be most progressive for people long term. If someone is extremely proficient at the conventional deadlift, but their sumo's lagging, by taking the time to work on their sumo and bring it up a few notches, usually their conventional increases as well. And further, if they're proficient at the sumo deadlift, but they're horrific at a conventional, by taking the time to drill some conventional work and increase their physical capacity on that specific lift, oftentimes they'll find a reverse carryover back over to their sumo. A few points worth noting with the sumo deadlift setup that makes it differ from the conventional deadlift. The first being that you're going to have a more vertical or upright torso, which opens the hip angle more, which means less stress on the lower back. As well, your foot placement is wider and your feet are turned out. That creates external rotation of the hips, which places a greater degree of stress on the glutes. And because of the position you have to get into and the upright torso you maintain, because your hip angle is open more, you tend to almost squat down a little bit more to get to the bar. And as a byproduct, that tends to close the knee joint angle, which places a greater degree of stress on the quads. Considering those points, the sumo deadlift can be an incredible variation for people who are looking for more quad development if that happens to be a weak point that they struggle with, as well as if an individual is looking to strengthen their hips, sumo deadlifts will definitely do that. And most people, myself included, tend to have relatively weak hips. Further, what's also valuable is any individuals that might be training with the intent to maybe get stronger, but they're really cautious when it comes to lower back stress. Maybe they've had an injury in the past that they have to work around, and or they're just kind of getting into training with heavier weights and they're a little bit worried about what they're getting themselves into. This is a great way to kind of bypass much of the stress that you might experience with a conventional deadlift until you build up all of that surrounding musculature. And of course, you're still going to be applying stress to the lower back, just not to the same degree as you would with a conventional deadlift. Also worth noting is those individuals who really want more glute development, and I know there's a lot of you out there, the sumo deadlift tends to deliver. As a byproduct of the upright torso position as well on the sumo deadlift, you'll often find that there's a much greater degree of stress applied to the upper back and specifically the traps. Next on the list, we've got rack pulls. Just when you thought, what variations next? We've covered the three most common rack pulls. They look like this. Now, rack pulls are typically incorporated with individuals who are struggling to lock out heavy weights on a full range of motion deadlift. Now, generally, rack pulls are incorporated from immediately below the knee. But the cool thing about rack pulls is you can be extremely specific as to the range of motion you need to work on relative to your individual sticking points. So you could technically pull from 3 inches below the knee. You could also adjust the safeties that you're pulling off of, and you could pull from above the knee if you felt or you knew that that was your individual sticking point. And generally, when incorporating rack pulls to overcome a sticking point, they are programmed in the 6 rep and under range. They're done relatively heavy, considering you're trying to become proficient at locking out heavy loads. Most people can work with a heavier load on a rack pull through a shorter range of motion as well than they can on the deadlift that they're struggling with. So this also allows for the opportunity to overload the system. Interestingly enough though, rack pulls are also extremely beneficial when incorporated in high rep ranges when considering muscular development and grip strength. Incorporating moderate loads on the rack pull for sets of say 8 to 12, 12 to 15, or even as high as 15 to 20 are great for developing the upper back, traps, and of course the forearms and musculature of the hands. Last but not least, deficit deadlifts. If you've never done these before, let me tell you, you're missing out. Now what you'll find with pulls from a deficit is you tend to have a much more exaggerated forward torso lean. This closes the hip angle, which places a greater emphasis on the lower back, glutes, and hamstrings as primary. And what you'll find is that the deficit deadlift presents an increased range of motion, and that increased range of motion forces a lifter to accelerate the load from a position that isn't necessarily optimal mechanically, considering that the hip joint is closed to a much greater degree than it would otherwise be on a shorter range of motion in, say, a conventional deadlift. This contributes to the development of a much greater force production capacity. This proves extremely beneficial because when you remove this deficit from the pull, you still have the benefit of having that greater force production capacity, and when returning to a shorter range of motion with which your mechanical advantage has returned, you're in a more optimal starting position. You have that optimal starting position combined with that increased force production, and you're able to move heavier loads with a much greater degree of efficiency as a byproduct. It's also worth noting that deficit deadlifts, because of the increased range of motion, lead to greater time under tension when pulling rep for rep compared to a shorter range of motion, and as a byproduct they do tend to contribute more to muscular development. Obviously, there's many more pulling variations that are available to us than these 5. These 5 just tend to be the most common ones, and the lifts that people that frequent the gym are most familiar with, because even if they haven't done them, they've usually seen others execute them on the weight room floor. Now, this certainly wasn't an exhaustive video by any stretch of the imagination. More detail can be gone into on each lift individually, but I wanted to take the time to give you a brief overview of each one. Now, if you found this video to be informative, if you found it to be useful to you in any way, please make sure you follow or subscribe depending on what platform you might be seeing this content on. And as per usual, if you have any specific questions relating to training, nutrition, or health in general, send them my way. And if I'm able to answer them, you'll see them in an upcoming piece of content.